He claimed he killed over 200 people, a freelance assassin who worked for the most powerful mob bosses in America. They called him the Iceman. But the story of Richard Kuklinski, well, it's really a chilling tale of two very different men, the suburban father and the monster. Today, we're going to separate the man from the myth. 100 to 200 men. Just let that sink in for a second. That's the claim that built the entire Iceman legend. It's a staggering number that immediately made him one of the most feared killers in the country. But, it's also the claim that hides a much more complicated and maybe even more disturbing truth. Because really, the most chilling part of the Iceman story isn't just the body count, it's the duality. The monster he claimed to be out on the streets was somehow living this totally separate life as a suburban father, a life that was hidden in plain sight. So picture this, the quiet suburb of Dumont, New Jersey. To his neighbors, he was just Richard, a family man, a guy who ran his own business, the absolute picture of normalcy. But behind that white picket fence was a darkness that no one could have possibly imagined. It was, when you think about it, the perfect cover. But behind closed doors, that whole facade just crumbled. His wife, Barbara, she said she lived with two different men. There was good Richie, who could be this loving, doting father. And then there was bad Richie, a creature of just pure rage who would terrorize his family. So the violence he was known for on the streets, yeah, it started at home. Sooner or later, a secret life like that is bound to unravel. And for Kuklinski, it happened when a dedicated law enforcement task force, codenamed Operation Iceman, started pulling at the threads, determined to finally expose the man behind the suburban mask. And this right here is how he got that infamous name. It wasn't about his personality being cold, it was about a specific chilling technique. To try and hide the time of death, he literally froze the body of one of his victims, a man named Louis Masgay. The plan only failed because a sharp medical examiner found ice crystals still inside the body, which gave police a crucial lead and gave the media a legendary name, the Iceman. And here's the thing, when you actually examine the murders he was investigated for, a totally different picture starts to emerge. These weren't some glamorous mafia hits. Nope. These were gritty personal killings, business partners, and even members of his own burglary crew, all murdered for money or just to make sure they kept their mouths shut. The net finally closed, thanks to some classic, old-school undercover police work. For 18 long months, an ATF agent named Dominic Polifrone posed as a mobster, slowly gaining Kuklinski's trust. The big breakthrough came when Polifrone got Kuklinski on tape, just bragging about his murder methods and even agreeing to do one more hit. That was it. They had him. With all that evidence stacked against him, the court's judgment was swift and it was absolute. 4 consecutive life sentences. That made sure Richard Kuklinski would never, ever see the outside of a prison again. But what's so incredible is that this wasn't the end of his story. It was really just the beginning of his legend. Because behind bars, Kuklinski completely reinvented himself. He was no longer just some convicted killer. He became a media star, and he started crafting this sensational and, highly profitable new version of his life story. From his prison cell, he launched a whole new career. Through books and those now infamous HBO documentaries, the Iceman tapes, he spun his horrifying tales for a public that just couldn't get enough. Crime, it turns out, paid really well for him, even in prison. And the scale of what he claimed was just breathtaking. He wasn't just some low-level thug anymore. According to him, he was a key player in the biggest mafia stories of the century. He said he killed Jimmy Hoffa. He took credit for the assassinations of mobsters like Roy DeMeo and Paul Castellano. He was methodically building this terrifying and completely fictional resume. Which, of course, brings us to the biggest question of all. How much of any of this was actually true? So let's separate the myth from the reality and deconstruct the legend of the Iceman. And the very first crack in this whole myth is right there in the numbers. He claimed over 200 victims. The number of murders he was actually convicted of? 6. The gap between his story and the actual facts is just gigantic. Even the man who probably knew him best, that undercover agent Dominic Polifrone, he didn't buy it. After spending 18 months right by his side, Polifrone believed Kuklinski was a killer, for sure, but that this epic body count, it was all just a performance, wildly exaggerated for the cameras. And his most famous claims, they just crumble under the slightest bit of scrutiny. The FBI flat out called his Jimmy Hoffa confession a hoax. The mastermind of the Paul Castellano hit, Sammy the Bull Gravano, never once mentioned his name. Veteran mobsters said they'd never even heard of the guy. He was, as one journalist put it perfectly, the Forrest Gump of mob hits, always claiming to be there, but only in his own mind. So once you strip away all of the TV interviews and the tall tales, what are you actually left with? Not some legendary mafia enforcer, but the ruthless leader of a small-time burglary ring, a violent predator who murdered his own friends and associates for money and for self-preservation. Which really leaves us with this final thought. Richard Kuklinski was, without a doubt, a monster. But was his greatest and most elaborate creation the myth of the Iceman itself? A final terrifying con that he played on all of us from behind prison walls?